Today, we are diving into some seriously classic nonfiction to figure out why books written hundreds of years ago can feel like they were written just for us, like right now.
I mean, it's a totally fair question, isn't it? With all the new stuff coming out every single day, why should we bother with texts from the 1700s or the early 1900s? What could they possibly have to say that still matters?
Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. These books stick around because they get right to the heart of what it means to be human, the parts of us that just don't change. They're about the same struggles for justice, freedom, and meaning that we're still dealing with today. So, our first guide on this little trip is going to be Aldous Huxley. He had this amazing idea about how we see tragedy, and he called it the whole truth. This idea really flips the script on our usual view of tragedy, right? We love to focus on that big, dramatic moment of loss. But Huxley says, hold on, the real story, the whole truth, is everything that happens after that moment.
So, what he's really saying is that we have this habit of making suffering seem, well, romantic. We ignore the quiet, messy, day-to-day grind of just carrying on. The real tragedy isn't the big bang, it's the long, slow, unglamorous job of having to keep going.
And this is what makes it so timeless. I mean, think about it. You've got Odysseus in ancient Greece watching his entire crew die, but he has no choice. He has to keep sailing. Now, fast forward to today, people dealing with personal loss or watching global crises unfold. The details are different, but that fundamental experience of loss, followed by the sheer necessity of endurance, that is absolutely eternal. Okay, let's jump to our next thinker and see how this all connects. We're moving ahead to 1931 with Virginia Woolf, who is fighting a totally different but just as universal kind of battle. Wow, what a sentence, right? Now, obviously, Woolf isn't talking about a literal person. She's describing this deep, internal war against a kind of phantom that was haunting creative women in her day. So, who or what was this angel? So the angel in the house was this voice inside your head, this ghost of the perfect woman. She had to be selfless, always charming, and never, ever have a strong opinion of her own. Woolf knew that to be a real writer, to say something true, she first had to metaphorically kill this part of herself that was always whispering, be nice, be quiet, don't make a fuss. And just look at how this plugs right into our world today. The angel might go by a different name now. Maybe we call it imposter syndrome, or the pressure to be perfect, or the fight against unconscious bias. But the core struggle, it's exactly the same. It's that fight to push back against stereotypes and claim your own voice. So when you really boil it down, Woolf's fight isn't just about being a writer. It's about something every single one of us can relate to. That struggle to find out who you are, the fight to have control over your own life, and the courage it takes to stand up and be heard. All right, for our last example, we're going to get into Time Machine and go way back to the 18th century with Jonathan Swift. He used a very different kind of weapon to expose injustice, the razor-sharp edge of satire. Okay, wow. That is just shocking to read, right? And that's exactly the reaction Swift wanted. He wasn't a monster, he was a genius. He wrote this absolutely horrific thing to force people to look at an even more horrific reality. So here's what was really happening. Swift wrote a modest proposal to attack the incredibly cruel British policies towards the Irish poor. By suggesting something so unbelievably barbaric, he was basically holding a mirror up to the powerful and saying, see, this is the logical end of how you're treating people. It's monstrous. And again, just like with Woolf, the connection to today is just chillingly clear. The specific names and places have changed, but the fundamental problem of systemic inequality, of economic systems that grind down the most vulnerable among us, that conversation is just as urgent now as it was in 1729. So let's pull back for a second. We've looked at Huxley, Woolf, and Swift, three totally different writers from three different centuries, talking about three very different things. But when you zoom out, you start to see that they're all pointing at the same fundamental truths. So let's just lay it all out. Huxley shows us that suffering and our ability to endure it are a permanent part of life. Woolf reminds us that the fight for personal freedom and identity is never really over. And Swift proves that a sharp piece of satire can be a powerful weapon against injustice, no matter what century you're in. So what this really all means is that these works aren't just dusty old books on a shelf. They're living, breathing conversations. They speak to us today because the core challenges of being human, dealing with pain, fighting to be ourselves, and demanding a just world, those things just don't have an expiration date. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. If these writers captured the timeless truths of their own times so perfectly, what are the ones from our era? What struggles, what insights from our world today will people be reading about and trying to understand hundreds of years from now? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.